The Most Absolute Abolition is the first full-length study of the interconnected networks of the vigilance committees, of how they organized the Underground Railroad, learned from thousands of runaways, exacerbated the sectional crises of the 1850s, helped plan John Brown's raid, and revolutionized abolitionism in the process. Vigilance committees were urban anti-slavery organizations formed throughout the North, committed to defending Black neighborhoods from police and slave catchers, and to helping runaway slaves escape enslavement. Committee members came from all walks of life. Most were African American, working class, or women. They were also prominent abolitionists, Maroons, sailors, feminists, wayward intellectuals, reprobate ministers, and other outcasts from America's racist, conformist civil society. They built up an elaborate network of allies in the South, in Canada, in Haiti, in the British Isles, and helped as many as 10,000 people in their self-liberation. A great deal of the book covers the organizational history of the vigilance committees, their diverse members, how they were formed, what they did, how fugitives escaped to the committees and where they went, as well as the local, transregional, and transnational political communities both fugitives and abolitionists were embedded in. However, above all, this book is an attempt to write an intellectual history of the Underground Railroad. It is that crucial aspect I would like to briefly sketch today. All too often, the scholarly history of the Underground Railroad merely narrates daring stories of escape or uncovers how fugitives were secretly moved from one station to another. The Fugitives Underground is rarely ever treated as a radical space of learning, ideas, and imagination. Yet it is precisely because the Underground Railroad and the vigilance committees in particular opened up the spaces where fugitives and Northern activists could exchange ideas that the most absolute dreams and deeds of the abolitionist movement could be made thinkable. The Underground Railroad was a movement of ideas as much as people. The movement of ideas began immediately when fugitives arrived at the offices of the various vigilance committees. In order to uncover spies or help others, and just to learn what the slave economy was like and how it could be resisted, vigilance activists routinely interviewed fugitives that came to them, in many cases recording in detail their conversations. Though some of these records were destroyed or lost, I have uncovered nearly 2,000 recorded instances of such interviews or conversations. It was during these understudied interviews that abolitionists and fugitives came into dialogue for the first time, and fugitives became a part of abolitionism. For example, the story of Isaac Williams best illustrates the significance of these interviews to abolitionist thought. When Williams arrived at the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee in 1851, Black abolitionist William Still sat down and asked Williams to narrate his whole life's history. Williams talked of his life in Virginia, his cruel master, his daily forced toil. He spoke of how he escaped, of how he fled to the woods to live as a Maroon, how he fought slave catchers and received a bullet wound in his arm, how he finally escaped from jail and got to Philadelphia. Still listened considerately, wrote down his narrative, and entertained him with stories of others he had helped escape. Still then sent Williams to the Syracuse Vigilance Committee. The leader of that committee, Tennessee fugitive and radical minister Jermaine Logan, also interviewed him and escorted him to Canada. In Canada, abolitionist Hiram Wilson interviewed Williams yet again, and then he published that exchange in a book of interviews he conducted with Canadian runaways. Debilitated by the bullet wound incurred fighting slave catchers, Williams went back to Syracuse, where Logan arranged a free surgery. Until he recovered and could work again, Logan employed Williams as a lecturer. Though he had lectured in churches and anti-slavery meetings, he also went to gatherings of teachers at local schools who wanted to better teach about the wrongs of slavery and white supremacy. Having rehearsed his story so many times, Williams eventually published a slave narrative after the Civil War. In their interviews with abolitionists, fugitives explained and denounced all. Besides speaking of their own lives, they spoke in elaborate detail about the political economy of slavery. They spoke of work hours, labor processes, disciplinary regimes, factory labor, home labor, and farm labor, and the significance of their work to the US economy. They laid particular emphasis on the false and hypocritical Christianity preached by their masters. Women fugitives spoke very openly about the sexual violence they suffered and of how women did most of the reproductive and productive work that underpinned the slave economy. In hundreds of instances, freedom seekers described enslavement as a kind of incarceration, but worse, and named slavery the prison house. The Israelites had called the Exodus their escape from the prison house of bondage. Fugitives used the biblical illusion of confinement and escape from their very first descriptions of enslavement, and soon it became the most widely used euphemism for slavery within the anti-slavery movement. In addition, fugitives imparted detailed knowledge of their own politics of resistance. This included depictions of everyday resistance, such as work stoppages, forging passes, abortions, and secret religious gatherings. Runaways told vigilance committees that enslaved people knew of emancipation in the West Indies and secretly celebrated it. Many others spoke of intimate knowledge of the abolitionist movement or of the heroic 1831 revolt led by Nat Turner. Maroons who later decided to flee north spoke at great length about marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. For sure, Vigilance Committee activists used, indeed invented, the now conventional terminologies of the Underground Railroad, such as lines, conductors, agents, etc., to describe their work. But they also likened vigilance committees to schools in which ideas were produced and fugitives did most of the teaching. This pedagogy from below began in the interviews with fugitives and was further bolstered during the public and private meetings of the vigilance committees. Though their main purposes was to raise funds, strategize, or to raise public awareness, vigilance committee meetings were wild events. Activists gave speeches, did a lot of cussing and debating, but also read aloud poetry and sang songs. Singing was a particularly privileged activity. Black abolitionist Charlotte Ray, for instance, brought fugitives she assisted along with her on her anti-slavery singing tours. Poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper composed songs based upon her interviews with fugitives. Clearly, activists spoke or sang of the daily business of the abolitionist underground, but much else as well. At one New York Vigilance Committee meeting, fugitive Samuel Ringgold Ward gave a speech on the 1848 revolutions in Europe. At a Philadelphia Vigilance Committee meeting, fugitive William Wells Brown gave a speech denouncing America's imperialist designs against free Haiti. In a speech at an 1841 New York Vigilance Committee meeting, runaway Harriet Lloyd praised that committee and loudly denounced other anti-slavery organizations for not creating enough space for formerly enslaved women to voice their ideas. Vigilance committees were quite adept at the circulation of the printed word. Many disaffected intellectuals were attracted to the adventurous work of the committees. This included such fugitive writers from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, to Northern Black writers like William Cooper Monell, to white transcendentalists such as Thoreau and Monsieur Conway, the son of a Virginia planter who helped enslaved people escape from his father's own estate. The New York Vigilance Committee had its own library. William Still used the funds of the Philadelphia Committee to patronize famous Black authors such as Wells Brown and Harper. All vigilance committees kept a store of pamphlets, newspapers, as well as books for practical use. They sent such materials to fugitives doing research in order to write autobiographies or to itinerant lecturers. The fruits of this pedagogy transformed the abolitionist movement. On one hand, vigilance committees brought into the organized abolitionist movement sailors, dock workers, fugitives, market women, and others not originally prominent in the middle-class dominated anti-slavery societies. They built ties between feuding anti-slavery factions that rent the movement in the 1840s. More importantly, the committees made fugitive aid into a foundational tactic of the movement well before the revamped Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. In the 1830s, the anti-slavery societies perceived the work of vigilance committees as less essential than the work of moral suasion. Some even believed that helping runaways did not necessarily make one an abolitionist. By the mid-1840s, due to the persistent lobbying of fugitives and vigilance committees, all this changed. Anti-slavery societies funded the vigilance committees and openly endorsed the work of the committees. However, the intellectual creativity of the committees went well beyond this in many utopian directions. I will mention just two of the numerous directions: Pan-African sensibilities and prison abolition. African-American activists in particular were more than aware that the struggle for Black liberation was not local or even national, but international. This Pan-Africanist sensibility found clearest expression in the Detroit Vigilance Committee, where the highest-ranking leaders did not take on titles such as president or treasurer, but used such titles as Chevalier of Ethiopia or Knight of Saint Domingo. Indeed, ties with Haiti were very strong. Committee members such as Eliza Wright and Sidney Gay maintained correspondence with Haitian activists. Others like James McCune Smith, Wendell Phillips, and William Wells Brown frequently delivered riot-inciting lectures on the Haitian Revolution. The committees sent fugitives to Haiti, and a number of Black vigilance activists promoted emigration to Haiti. The committees even had some connections to Africa. For instance, in the late 1830s and early 1840s, the New York Vigilance Committee's traveling agent was Augustus William Hanson, a native of the Gold Coast, now Ghana. Hanson had been born into an elite Ashanti family, converted to Christianity. He came to the US and quickly became angered by the vicious racism he encountered in the Christian land of the free. He only found meaningful community amidst the Vigilance Committee. As traveling agent, Hanson moved about, raising funds and giving lectures to promote the work of the committee. But he also delivered informative lectures about his life in Africa and the customs of the Ashanti. Hanson insisted in his lectures that if he kept mute on racial injustices in America, he would have no right to call himself an African. Drawing on their work assisting fugitives, some militants even prophesied the abolition of prisons. Of course, fugitives and their allies served time for illegal activities, kept watch on police, and even fought them, and generally had antipathy to all forms of confinement. It went further. As an example, when Charles Torrey, who worked with the Boston, Albany, and Philadelphia Vigilance Committees, served his second jail sentence in Baltimore in the 1840s for helping runaways. He held discussions with inmates, many of them fugitives. He planned to use the knowledge gathered in these interviews to write a book critiquing the entire penitentiary system, which he saw as little more than a system meant to enslave minds and bodies, antagonize the poor, and the racialized. Sadly, Torrey died of tuberculosis in jail before this project could be completed. Charles K. Whipple, a Boston Vigilance Committee member, wrote up a manual for organized fugitive defense against police in 1851. In 1860, he wrote a sequel to this plan. There, Whipple argued that communities ought to regulate themselves democratically. Every neighborhood should be patrolled by democratically elected pacifists who carried no weapons, arrested no one, and dissuaded people from immoral actions merely with words. Concurrently, Whipple imagined communities in which prisons were no longer needed. Abolitionists lived through an age of upheavals greater far than the Atlantic age of revolution of the late 18th century. It began with the independence of Haiti and Spanish America and quickly cascaded into radical abolitionism, Fenianism, Chartism, the 1848 revolutions, the 1857 revolt in India, and Heavenly Kingdom of the Taiping rebels, the largest insurrection in history. Abolitionists, particularly VC members, were aware of these international currents of convulsion and supported them. In the process, they theorized abolition as a revolutionary, even anti-imperial process, and tried to actualize their theories. Insurrectionary sensibility came in many ways. Irish laborer Henry Kemp, who rescued dozens of fugitives from the docks of Boston, had a background with the insurrectionary Young Ireland movement. Seth Conklin traveled to Florida to observe firsthand Seminole resistance. One fugitive proudly told William Still that he was the nephew of Billy Bowlegs, the leader of Seminole resistance to US aggression in the 1850s. Over 80 runaways narrated to the vigilance committees of having escaped armed. Fugitive John Henry Hill organized an armed Black militia in Canada and wrote letters to Still, arguing that the world should be turned upside down through armed slave insurrection. Ex-slave Thomas Smallwood, who helped dozens of runaways flee the nation's capital, thought along similar lines. He believed that a terrible and bloody breakup of the American empire was the only way to relieve Africans from slavery and Native Americans from genocide. He hoped that Mexico would declare war against the US, reclaim its lost territories, and incite slave revolt in the process. Though I won't discuss this here, a significant part of my book discusses how Vigilance Committee knowledge, practical experience, and theorizing provided the backbone for John Brown's plots to overthrow slavery. His Secret Six co-conspirators were all active in the vigilance movement. He gathered most of his advice and funds from the Chatham, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Boston Vigilance Committees. Thus, from the fugitive crisis of the 1850s to John Brown's raid, vigilance committees had a hand in the sectional conflicts that eventually culminated in civil war. And to conclude, reflecting on the long history of slave resistance, the political prisoner of many decades, the late Russell Maroon Shoatz, wrote, quote, "The Underground Railroad stands as the most militant, egalitarian movement this country has ever seen. There were vigilance committees, Underground Railroad conductors, and stockholders. These brave and committed individuals were the technicians of the movement, while its heart and soul were always the runaways themselves," end quote. In short, the aim and argument of the most absolute abolition has been to demonstrate the sharpness and accuracy of this remarkable statement. Thank you.